Good morning, everybody. Hope you had a good long weekend. Sorry I'm getting started a little bit late this morning. I had a meeting and then I just had some technical difficulties. I am going to start with our poetry read aloud. If you saw I posted the assignments in Google Classroom, one thing we're going to do differently this week, you will not have a separate writing section. Your poetry response is going to be just a little bit longer. So you're still going to free write responding to the poem, like what is your thinking? What are your feelings? Do you notice any poetry elements? But I'm also asking you to respond to a different question, a specific question each day with each different poem. So it should be about 15 to 20 minutes of writing, whereas last week maybe you just wrote for 10 minutes. Okay, so we are reading another poem out of our book, My Name is Jorge, On Both Sides of the River. These are poems in English and Spanish, so I will read the English first and then Spanish. And this poem kind of goes along with a poem that we read last week called T-shirt. So make sure you're just listening and making that connection. Okay, here it is. My name is Jorge. My name is Jorge. I know that my name is Jorge, but everyone calls me George. George, what an ugly sound, like a sneeze. George. And the worst of all is that this morning a girl called to me, George, and I turned my head. I don't want to turn into a sneeze. Okay, so you can replay it if you want to as you are responding to the poem, if you need to hear a certain part or anything. Now I'm going to go ahead and read it in Spanish as well. Me llamo Jorge. Me llamo Jorge. Sé que mi nombre es Jorge, pero todos me llaman George. George. Qué feo sonido, como un estornudo. George. Y lo peor de todo es que hoy en la mañana una niña me llamó George y volteé la cabeza. No quiero convertirme en un estornudo. Okay, so you can, again, pause the video, watch it back, go ahead and write your response. And we are going to move into our read aloud. You can come back to the video after you are done writing your poetry response. Okay, so our learning target for today is I can think about how repeated objects, images, or characters represent something else, and then think about how this symbol might connect to a possible theme. Okay, so we are on chapter 25. Now, I want you to think back to books that we have read this year and repeated objects, because we have talked about repeated objects before. We just maybe haven't went the extra step and connected them to the theme. So if you remember, we read Sadako, okay? And definitely, obviously, the repeated object was the paper crane. Actually, we did talk about this. We talked about what the crane represented and why they kept repeating it. So if you remember, the crane represented strength and hope for Sadako to get over her illness. Keck, he also had a repeated object, which was a piece of his mother's skirt. Remember, we later learned he had this piece of cloth that he carried around, and we learned that it was a piece of his mother's skirt, and he kept it. And that was also representative of the hope that he had throughout the story that he would be reunited with his mother somehow. Okay. Let me go ahead and shut this window. So he just had this hope, and that piece of clothing represented that for him. So yes, it was a piece of clothing, but it represented something deeper. Who else? We had Naomi. She, if you remember, carved these figurines out of soap. Okay. And that for her represented actually a piece of her father. So these stories are all kind of universal and connected. They have something in common with the objects that were repeated throughout the story. So Naomi carved the soap when she was feeling a certain kind of way, and it helped her to relax. Remember, her hands would shake and She would have all kinds of nerves and stuff. But it was still that connection with her father, who she hadn't seen and who she was searching for. If we look at Peter, his hat, remember, he would put on and take his hat off when he was trying to make a decision or didn't know what to do. And we saw him repeatedly do that. And it was kind of his, he couldn't make up his mind about whether his sister was alive or not. And also, the major repeated object in the magician's elephant with Peter was obviously the elephant. Okay, so the elephant was present throughout the story and repeated, and it again represented that hope or connection that he had in finding his sister. Okay, so in fantasy also, we are just paying attention to these symbols that are repeated throughout the story, and then thinking deeper about what they mean and making that connection then to the theme. So I'm going to show you a little chart here. Again, if you need to just use this as you are reading today and doing your work, you can just pull up the video and press it on pause so you can see it. But it says that fantasy readers can use symbols to identify themes. Okay, so just first thing while you're reading, be prepared to find symbols. Okay, symbols might be images, objects, characters, or even settings. We have seen in the book that we are reading, the setting's truly important. It's almost like a main character in itself. These symbols are repeated. So you can see the little crown is repeated. That represents that our symbol's repeated. In all of the read alouds we did this year, the symbol was basically an object that was important to the character. Then you're going to think about what each symbol might represent. Okay, and we did that this year. Remember, I just went through them. The paper crane represented hope and strength to get over the illness. Kek's piece of his mother's skirt represented his hope that he would once be reunited with her. Naomi, same thing, this figure that she had was a talent that she got from her dad when she was little. And Peter, the elephant, was a repeated object. The elephant also could be considered a character, I think, even though it's an animal. So number 3, then, you are going to think about how different symbols, if there are multiple symbols, fit together. So the magician's elephant and Peter would be a good example. He had his hat, he had the elephant, so there's not just one symbol. Also in Naomi Leon, she carved multiple soap figures, but one that stands out the most was the lion. Okay, and it is representative because her last name was actually Leon, which means lion. Okay, and that connects with the theme and how the story ended up and how Naomi ended in the resolution. Number 4, then you will connect the symbols to possible themes. So in my example, I have the crown that represents power. Maybe there's a crown that represents power and also an important repeated setting. Maybe there's like a castle that could mean strength. I can connect those two and come up with a theme that says power and strength can be used for good. Okay, so here is your step-by-step that you are going to use to look at repeated symbols and connect them to possible themes in whatever story that you are reading, fantasy story, independently. So just focusing on the genre of fantasy, some symbols or objects that are very popular, you have the crown. So usually the crown represents power or royalty. Sometimes there's dragons. They can represent bad. Unicorns oftentimes represent good. Sometimes rain is very prevalent. We have even seen in our read aloud, The Thief of Always, that rain has often been repeated. It can represent good or bad, depends on the story and the context of what's happening. And again, you just look at these different symbols, put them together, and think about and question yourself, well, excuse me, what does it all mean? So we are going to go ahead now and read chapter 25. It is called The Vortex. Again, my favorite strategy, since we have not read since Thursday, is just going back, rereading the last paragraphs to kind of put ourselves into the story again. Okay, so here's the end of chapter 24. Here at last was the evil that had built the holiday house, shaped more or less as a man. He was not made of flesh, blood, and bone, however. He had used the magic Rickus had unwillingly provided to create another body. In the high times of his evil, Hood had been the house. Now it was the other way around. The house, or what was left of it, had become Mr. Hood. And I think I ended the last lesson by showing you this picture or this illustration that the pieces, remember, Harvey had reversed Hood's power onto himself and in turn destroyed the house. Now Hood has used the power that Rictus stole from him, and this is now the form that his evil has taken. Okay, so here is chapter 25 with permission of HarperCollins Children's Books. His eyes were made of broken mirrors, and his face of gouged stone. He had a mane of splinters and limbs of timber. He had shattered slates for teeth and rusty screws for fingernails, and a cloak of rotted drapes that scarcely hid the darkness of his heart from sight. "So, thief," he said, ignoring Rictus's pitiful struggles, "you see me as the man I was, or rather, as a copy of that man. Is it what you expected?" "Yes," Harvey said. "It's exactly what I expected." "Oh?" "Yeah, you're dirt and muck and bits and pieces," Harvey said. "You're nothing." "Nothing, am I?" said Hood. "Nothing? Ha! I'll show you, thief. I'll show you what I am." "Let me kill him for you," Rictus managed to gasp. "You needn't bother, I'll do it." "You brought him here," Hood said, turning his splintered eyes on his servant. "You're to blame." "He's a boy, I can deal with him. Just let me do it, let me." Before Rictus could finish, Hood took hold of his servant's head and with one short motion simply twisted it off. A yellowish cloud of foul-smelling air rose from the severed neck, and Rictus, the last of Hood's abominable quartet, perished in an instant. Hood let the head go from his hand. It flew up into the air like an unknotted balloon, giving off a farting sputter as it looped the loop and finally fell, emptied, to the ground. Hood casually dropped the body, which had summarily shrunk to nothing, and turned his mirrored gaze upon Harvey. "Now, thief," he said, "you will see power." His mane of splinters stood on end, as though every one of them was ready to pierce Harvey's heart. His mouth grew wide as a tunnel, and a blast of sour, icy air rose from his belly. "Come closer," he roared, opening his arms. The rags that clung there billowed and spread like the wings of some ancient vampire, a vampire that had dined on the blood of pterodactyl and tyrannosaur. "Come," he said again, "or must I come for you?" Harvey didn't waste his breath with a reply. He'd need every gasp he had if he was to outpace this horror. Not even certain what direction he was taking, he turned on his heels and ran as another blast of soul-freezing air struck him. The ground was treacherous, slippery, and strewn with rubble. He fell within 6 strides and glanced back to see Hood descending upon him with a vengeful shriek. He hauled himself to his feet, Hood's rusted nails missing him by a whistling inch, and had taken 3 stumbling strides from Hood's shadow when he heard Lulu calling his name. He veered in the direction of her voice, but Hood caught the collar of his jacket. "Got you, little thief," he roared, dragging Harvey back into his splintery embrace. Before Hood could catch better hold, however, Harvey threw back his arms and pitched himself forward. Off came the jacket, and he made a third dash for his freedom. His eyes fixed on Lulu, who was beckoning him toward her. She was standing on the edge of the lake, he realized, perched inches from the spinning waters. Surely she didn't imagine she could escape into the lake. The vortex would tear them limb from limb. "We can't," he yelled to Lulu. "We must," she called. "It's the only way." He was within 3 strides of her now. He could see her feet, her bare feet, slithering and sliding on the slimy rock as she fought to keep her balance. He reached out for her, determined to snatch her from her perch before she fell, but her eyes weren't on him. They were on the monster at his back. "Lulu," he yelled to her, "don't look." But her gaze was fixed upon Hood, her mouth agape, and Harvey couldn't help but glance back to see what fascinated her so. Hood's pursuit had thrown his coat of rags into disarray, and there was something between its folds, He saw darker than any night sky or lightless cellar. What was it? The essence of his magic, perhaps, guarding his loveless heart. Do you give up? Hood said, driving Harvey back onto the rocks beside Lulu. Surely you would not choose the vortex over me? Go, Harvey murmured to Lulu, his gaze still fixed on the mystery beneath Hood's coat. He felt her hand grasp for his for a moment. It's the only way, she said. Then her fingers were gone, and he was standing on the rocks alone. If you choose the flood, you will die horribly, Hood was saying. It will spin you apart, whereas he extended an inviting hand to Harvey, stepping up onto the rock as he did so. I offer you an easy death, rocked to sleep on a bed of illusions. He made a smile, and it was the foulest sight Harvey had ever seen. Choose, he said. Out of the corner of his eye, Harvey glimpsed Lulu. She had not fled, as he thought. She'd simply gone to find a weapon. And she had one, a piece of timber dragged out of the rubble. It would be precious little use against Hood's enormity, Harvey knew, but he was glad not to be alone in his last moments. He looked up at Hood's face. Maybe I should sleep, he said. The Vampire King smiled. Wise little thief, he replied, opening his arms to invite the boy into his shadow. Harvey took a step over the rock toward Hood, raising his hand as he did so. His face was reflected in the shattered mirrors of the vampire's eyes. Two thieves in one head. Sleep, said Hood. But Harvey had no intention of sleeping yet. Before Hood could stop him, he grabbed hold of the creature's coat and pulled. The scraps came away with a wet, tearing sound, and Hood let out a howl of rage as he was uncovered. There was no great enchantment at his heart. In fact, there was no heart at all. There was only a void, neither cold nor hot, living nor dead, made not of mystery, but of nothingness. The illusionist's illusion. Furious at this revelation, Hood let out another roar of rage and reached down to reclaim the rags of his coat from the thief's hands. Harvey took a quick step backward, however, avoiding the fingers by a whisker. Hood came raging after him, his soul squealing on the rock, leaving Harvey with no choice but to retreat another step until he had nowhere to go but the flood. And I'm going to stop there and just point out, I think I am noticing a repeated object. Okay, remember, we're looking for repeated symbols. So we have water in this chapter, okay? And we have had water in other chapters. We had rain at the beginning. We had this lake that was present in the house throughout most of the story. The lake was deep. It was dark. It's where it held these ugly fish that we actually come to discover were the children that Hood had been keeping prisoner in this house. So as I'm reading here, we see that the water has turned to a vortex, and now it's being referred to as a flood. So I'm just noticing that symbol is repeated. Once I finish, I'm going to stop and talk about what I think that this symbol represents, and then hopefully I'll be able to connect that to a theme. Again, Hood snatched at the filched rags and would have had both coat and thief in one fatal grasp had Lulu not run at him from behind, swinging the timber like a baseball bat. She struck the back of Hood's knee so hard her weapon shattered, the impact pitching her to the ground. The blow was not without effect, however. It threw Hood off balance, and he flailed wildly, the thunder of the vortex shaking the rock on which he and Harvey perched and threatening to toss them both into the maelstrom. Even now, Hood was determined to claim his rags back from Harvey and conceal the void in him. "Give me my coat, thief," he howled. "It's all yours," Harvey yelled, and tossed the stolen rags toward the waters. Hood lunged after them, and as he did so, Harvey flung himself back toward solid ground. He heard Hood shriek behind him and turned to see the Vampire King, the rags in his fist, pitch head first into the frenzied waters. Okay, see how many times they've referred to water. It's just repeated throughout even this chapter. The maned head surfaced a moment later, and Hood struck out for the bank, but strong as he was, the vortex of water was stronger. It swept him away from the rocks, drawing him toward its center, where the waters were spiraling down into the earth. In terror, he started to plead for assistance, his pitiful bargains only audible when the whirlpool carried him to the bank where Harvey and Lulu now stood. "Thief," he yelled, "help me, and I'll give you the world forever and ever." Then the ferocity of the waters began to rip at his makeshift body, tearing out his nails and rattling out his teeth, washing away his mane of splinters and shaking his limbs apart at the joints. Reduced to a living litter of flotsam and jetsam, he was drawn into the white waters at the whirlpool's heart, and shrieking with rage, went where all evil must go at last, into nothingness. On the shore, Harvey put his arms around Lulu, laughing and sobbing at the same time. "We did it," he said. "Did what?" said a voice at their backs, and they looked around to see Wendell wandering toward them, blithe as ever. Every article of clothing he'd found in the rubble was either too large or too small. "What's been going on?" he wanted to know. "What are you laughing at? What are you crying for?" He looked beyond Harvey and Lulu in time to see the fragments of Hood's body disappear with a fading howl. "And what was that?" he demanded. Harvey wiped the tears from his cheeks and got to his feet. At last, he had a purpose for Wendell's perpetual reply. "Who cares?" he said. Okay, so chapter 25 does end there. And he has, at last, it appears, remember I always said it appears, defeated Hood. Okay. We have one more chapter, and we will actually be finishing, I believe, tomorrow. So what we're going to go ahead and talk about as our learning target today is I can think about how repeated objects, images, or characters represent something else, and then think about how this symbol is connected to a possible theme. I've already done some of the work. So I pointed out water. We've seen water repeated throughout the story. I referred to the rain at the beginning. It was very rainy and gray. And this, it could be repeated object or a setting more, probably more is the setting. The lake. So Harvey, at the beginning, he wanted to go to the lake, but somebody warned him not to. I think it was Wendell. They talked about how deep and dark it was. That's where the fish were kept. They even said it was dangerous. At one point, Harvey falls into the lake, and the ark actually sinks to the bottom. We see that Lulu is actually called, I guess, in a way to the lake, and she goes down and gets his ark, or the animals that were in the ark, and she's actually trapped there. Okay, we see that she turns into this fish-like body, as do all the other children who are held prisoners in this house. So again, in this not final chapter, but chapter 25, this chapter nearing the resolution, water is back again. It is an important part of the setting. So it's actually responsible for the demise of Hood. So Hood was the most powerful evil. He was in charge of the house. He was the strongest force imaginable. But the whirlpool, the vortex, was stronger than Hood. So basically, it says that in the end, evil had to go what evil had. Evil had to go where evil is, into nothingness. Okay, so we might take that step further and comment on what lesson is this teaching us about evil and about bad, okay, in the world even. That evil is nothing compared to good, which can overcome it. Okay, so again, that could be a lesson that we learn, thinking about what has happened with these repeated objects and even settings in our story. So the object of water, rain, the lake, and at the end, the vortex or whirlpool. And we could even look and see how the water evolves. It's repeated, but in different forms. Okay, so while we're reading, we're prepared to find the symbols. They might be images, objects, characters, or settings. They are repeated. We think about what the symbols represent, because remember, they're ordinary symbols, but they have a deeper meaning. We think about how different symbols can fit together, and then we connect those simple symbols to a possible theme. And remember, I gave you at the beginning some examples from books that we have read this year. Sadako and the Paper Crane, Keck and the piece of his mother's clothing, Naomi and her carving of soap figures and the lion, and then Peter and his hat or the elephant. Okay, so in your independent reading today, you're just going to do that same work. You're going to ask yourself, is there an object that is repeated? Is there any object that they describe in great detail? What could this be a symbol for? How does it fit with the rest of the story? And then does it support a theme that you already found? Or does it give you more support for the theme you've already found? Or does it suggest maybe a new theme that you never even thought of? Okay, so there are a few questions to help you in your writing to respond to chapter 25 today. And remember, this is on video. I know it's a lot. So feel free to go back and rewind and rewatch and re-listen to the story and look at charts and re-listen to my examples and everything. Okay, so that is it for today. Hope you have a great Monday. I will see you tomorrow. I'm going to try to get back on my starting my live at 9. I had a couple things going on this morning that prevented that, but work hard, take care, be safe, miss you guys. Have a great day.